Hello guys, welcome back to LR Anime. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of Soul Land 2 episode number 130 based on novel. So let's start. Very well. Since nobody has decided to back out, we shall commence the combat phase. May I invite 96 and 37 to start the first match? Hua Yuhao's individual bet with 98, along with the incredible value of their stakes, meant that they would probably be the last to fight. The first match would definitely be between the more unbalanced pairs. 37 fought against 96, and was already at a complete disadvantage in his aura and disposition. There was no suspense at all, and 96 took just 5 minutes to achieve an overwhelming victory. Then it was Hikaitu's turn against 85. Hikaitu gradually stepped towards the competition stage with a large cannon on his shoulders. He had crafted 5 soul tools, the black heavy cannon on his shoulder, a round breastplate, a shield, a waistplate, and a helmet. Those were his 5 different soul tools, and he was well equipped in terms of both attack and defense. Almost every single contestant chose this direction. Hikaitu's opponent was a little simpler in comparison. His opponent had a breastplate, and one relatively smaller soul cannon on each of his shoulders. He also had a belt-like soul tool around his waist. They were inside the Golden Hall's competition stage after all, and it was a lot smaller than the Continental Elite Youth Soul Master Tournament's competition stage. Neither party had much space to move around, and any long-range attacks could reach the other side in no time. The 3 judges returned to their positions, and the chief judge exclaimed, "Begin." Both Hikaitu and 85 unleashed their martial souls at almost the same time. Hikaitu was very quick, and 6 soul rings rose up from his feet. On seeing this, the audience erupted into shouts and exclamations. Hikaitu was a 6-ringed soul emperor, and this meant that this tall and broad-shouldered man in a mask was likely to be a Class 6 soul engineer as well. The people who had placed their bets on Hikaitu began to gasp and exclaim in joy and delight. 85 paled in comparison. He had 2 yellow and 3 purple soul rings, only 5 soul rings, and he didn't have the most optimal soul ring combination. Both parties chose to unleash the same soul tool initially, a protective soul barrier. A layer of white light rose up and enveloped their bodies inside. Both soul barriers were Class 5, as they had only had 10 hours to craft their soul tools. The belt-like soul tool that 85 had around his waist burst with colorful light, and circle after circle of intense light rippled out from it. His soul power undulations began to flourish with lightning speed. Wow! Look, everyone! The soul tool around 85's waist is an extremely rare energy-gathering soul tool. It can focus and condense the user's soul power over a short period of time. It's very difficult to create a soul tool like that, and one has to be very precise in the crafting process. Otherwise, one mistake will cause injuries to the user. I can imagine right now that 85's subsequent attack will as vigorous and violent as a thunderstorm. With his energy-gathering soul tool's amplification, his attacks can rival that of a Class 6 soul engineer for a short period of time. Hikaitu didn't respond as he watched his opponent's energy-gathering soul tool. He calmly raised his left arm and blocked his chest, the foot-long shield on his left arm beginning to chime faintly and radiate a layer of orangish-yellow light. Hey, look! What a great counter! The shield that 88 has chosen to use should be a soul-reflecting shield. This shield is highly resistant and effective against all soul power attacks, or more accurately, all kinds of soul rays. The only problem is that I can't tell what this soul-reflecting shield's class is. The fight begun, and Ajin's saliva was spewing all over the place as he commentated excitedly on the battle. An energy-gathering soul tool could temporarily increase a soul engineer's offensive ability, but it also consumed a lot more soul power. The user would have to achieve victory as quickly as possible. 85 felt his heart sink when he saw Hikaitu's 6 soul rings. He knew that he only had one chance to win. Because of this, he didn't wait for Hikaitu to do anything else, and fired off the twin soul cannons on his shoulders. 2 different lights blasted toward Hikaitu. The soul cannon on his left shoulder was a brilliant white soul ray. The air around it felt a little strange as this ray surged out, and everyone seemed to see cracks and tears in the air wherever this soul ray passed. The air seemed to become glassy and shatter in its wake. The other soul cannon fired a pink sphere of light. This sphere was as big as a fist, but it grew increasingly larger as it flew through the air. Every single contestant who could make it into the round of 6 had their own unique strengths, and 85 wasn't an exception. Even Hua Yuhao was a little astonished as he watched those soul cannons. Both of them were Class 5 soul tools that were rarely seen. The soul ray that cracked open the air as it flew was called a splitting shockwave. Even though it was similar to a shock bomb, there was a world of difference between them. Shock bombs relied on intense and forceful shockwaves and undulations, but the splitting shockwave resembled uncountable knives and blades. Powerful cutting effects would be dished out to the target, and it would cut in very irregular patterns. The splitting shockwave was highly destructive, fierce, and brutal. However, it was very difficult to craft one of these, and it was quite challenging to control it as well. Splitting shockwaves were inherently unstable and could easily injure their user. Therefore, soul engineers typically didn't opt for such a soul tool. However, 85 seemed very confident, and it was clear that he was very familiar with using similar soul tools. The pink sphere on the other side wasn't much worse, and it was known as an enfeebling cannon. This cannon could be considered a more primitive version of the aging ray which had been used on Wang Chua. It was difficult for any energy-based defenses to dispel or enfeebling cannon's effects, and anybody struck by it would immediately enter a weakened state. This weakened state was a prolonged and continuous one, and the victim would have to rest for a very long time to recover. Both soul tools were considered incredibly difficult to craft among Class 5 soul tools. Furthermore, a lot of soul power had to be consumed when using them. It was clear that 85 was prepared with his equipment. He had a Class 5 protective soul barrier to defend himself, and his energy-gathering belt boosted his soul power, while his two formidable soul cannons would take care of his opponent. His setup was quite impressive. The splitting shockwave was the first to reach Hikaitu. It clashed with Hikaitu's soul barrier, shrill and ear-piercing sounds ringing out. The audience could see cuts and scars swiftly webbing out across Hikaitu's soul barrier. The splitting shockwave's most frightening characteristic was that it could be fired continuously. As long as the user had enough soul power to sustain his or her attack, this attack could be used continuously and without pause. Of course, this attacking style increased the chances of the soul tool itself breaking apart. The enfeebling cannon shell followed immediately afterwards. It was not hard to imagine that Hikaitu's soul barrier would definitely not be able to withstand the splitting shockwaves if he entered a weakened state, and it was likely that that would be instantly sliced and diced into pieces. 85 immediately took the upper hand as he made his first attack. But Hikaitu wasn't worried or panicky from beginning to end. He pressed his shield and its orange light, and the orange radiance seemed to materialize as it wrapped around his protective soul barrier and barricaded the splitting shockwave without. The cracks and scars immediately vanished. Hikaitu's feet moved as the enfeebling cannon shell came shortly after. He took a step to the left, evading the attack with incredible speed. The fact that his large and bulky body could make such agile and nimble dodging movements was astonishing. The enfeebling cannon charge was locked onto him, however, and began to follow him as he waltzed around. The helmet on Hikaitu's head lit up, a bright silver beam erupting out of it and circling once around his body. The enfeebling cannon charge was pursuing closely behind him, so it was naturally encompassed within this beam's radius, and was instantly scooped up by the silver light. Is this what's known as a Class 5 capturing hand? It can capture any powerful energy-based existence, and is primarily used to counter stationary soul cannons. It's quite a surprise that 88 has created a soul tool like that. It's a very clever creation. Hikaitu's capturing hand wrapped around the enfeebling charge, and its lock-on effects were immediately dispelled. Hikaitu hurled the cannon charge back out towards 85, wanting to give his opponent a taste of his own medicine. The pink light sphere hurtled straight towards 85 at a speed faster than it had originally been launched at. 85 was overcome with shock, but his response was still appropriate. Hikaitu's capturing hand could capture any energy-based entity at a certain speed, but it couldn't keep any lock-on capabilities. 85 dodged to one side and avoided this cannon shell, but his splitting shockwave paused for a moment because of his movements. Right at that moment, a brilliant blue pillar of light surged across the competition stage. This blue pillar boomed like a thunderbolt, and the entire golden hall seemed to tremble and shiver along with it. There was only a protective dome around the competition stage, there wasn't a soundproofing barrier. Therefore, everybody in the audience could hear the crisp and deafening boom. The heavy cannon on Hikaitu's shoulder was finally unleashed, a lightning cannon. This was one of Hikaitu's favorite soul tools. Frightening lightning tore the air open as it thundered towards Hikaitu's opponent. The bluish-purple lighting caused the air to twist and contort, and 85 had just evaded his own enfeebling cannon charge when his face changed. Class 6. That's a Class 6 lightning cannon. My protective soul barrier can't handle that. He hesitated for a single moment before he shouted, I admit defeat. He did have an option against this attack. He could use his invincible barrier to defend himself, but doing so was no different from admitting defeat. Almost every soul engineer above Class 5 was equipped with an invincible barrier, but this item was so outrageously expensive that nobody would ever use it unless the circumstance was a matter of life and death. This was especially so when the tournament prohibited using soul tools that were not crafted during the tournament, and this meant using an invincible barrier was equivalent to admitting defeat. Boom. The lightning cannon was withdrawn after just one shot. But even so, 85 was immediately thrown backwards from the impact, and his Class 5 protective soul barrier instantly shattered. His soul power was almost entirely smashed away by the impact, and his entire body was burned black. He puked out a mouthful of blood when he dropped back to the ground. A Jin couldn't help but exclaim, 85 loves wealth more than he loves his life. I believe he has an invincible barrier with him, but he couldn't bear to use it. I would have done the same thing if I had been in his shoes. It's a pity I'm not a soul engineer. The battle was over, and victory had been determined. Hikaitu was actually quite merciful and generous. Otherwise, if he had unleashed his lightning cannon's strength to its fullest extent, 85 would have been heavily injured or instantly killed. Thank you for showing me mercy. 85 climbed to his feet and immediately bowed respectfully to Hikaitu. Even though he had lost this round, his opponent had instantly stopped attacking after he admitted defeat. He was full of goodwill towards his opponent. Hikaitu remembered everything that Hu Yuhao had told him. He didn't make a sound, but nodded in his opponent's direction before he departed the competition stage to claim his prize. 2 matches out of 3 were over. 96 was very powerful and dominant, and Hikaitu's last class 6 soul tool was equally strong and impressive. Both of them gave the audience a deep and lasting impression. Soul engineers typically resolved their combats very quickly, and rifts in strength and standards were quickly presented in a fight. The highlight of the show was about to begin, and the contestants that had bet against one another were about to fight. Everyone in the audience began to take shorter and quicker breaths. Some were pleased and others upset about the result of the previous 2 matches, but the third and final match had the best odds. This was especially true for those who had placed their bets on Hu Yuhao. Every single one of them could feel butterflies in their stomach. Even though they knew their chances of winning their bets were slim, they still had to hold on to that thread of hope until the very end. The odds were 1 to 3, these was considered very good odds, and they would make windfall profits if they won this bet. Those who had placed their bets on 98 weren't worried at all. 6 soul tools versus 1, unless his opponent had a trump card that ensured his victory, 98's advantage was just too evident. There was nothing they had to be worried about at all. Hu Yuhao smiled, but his smile felt a little chilly. Officials pushed his wheelchair onto the competition stage, and 98 stepped onto the stage on the other side, fully equipped with his 6 soul tools. Their gazes met, and the corner of 98's mouth curled into a smile. Do you feel the pressure now, little fellow? Give it up. I won't kill you, considering you've given me such a nice present. I'll let you keep your life because of that. Hu Yuhao's face was black. We haven't even fought yet. How are you so sure that you'll win? Let me tell you, I have a lot of soul power. 98 laughed heartily and said, that means you want to use that shield of yours to grind me down until I have no soul power left. Do you think that's realistic? I have at least 100 ways of breaking through your defenses. You're so outrageous and arrogant even though you're sitting on that wheelchair. Now I understand why you are crippled. Hu Yuhao felt a knot form in his heart. Even though he was intentionally showing weakness to his opponent, he still didn't feel very happy when his opponent labeled him as an outrageous and arrogant cripple. We'll see during the match. I hope you won't cry after losing the battle. The darkness green dragon, huh? It's already mine, Hu Yuhao grunted coldly, but he didn't seem like he had any substance to back up his words. My darkness green dragon is right here. I'm afraid you can only look at it. Ha ha ha. 98 waved his right hand, and a dark green light waltzed around his fingertips like a spiritual serpent that had come alive. Hu Yuhao had to admit that 98 was quite accomplished with soul tools, and he had his own attainments. Judge. Hu Yuhao suddenly shouted. All 3 judges turned towards him confusedly. Hu Yuhao said, I've already given my stake to you before this. The crafting phase is over, so shouldn't 98 give his stake to you just like I have? That's only fair. 98 felt his face freeze for a moment, but he quickly returned to normal. He generously revealed the darkness green dragon in his hands and said, take it away, then. It will come back to me in a moment's time, anyway. Hu Yuhao could clearly tell that 98 couldn't bear to part with his carving knife when the judges took it away. All soul engineers at every class were as intimate with the carving knife they always used as if it were their own child. It was natural that any soul engineer would feel a little out of place without their favorite carving knife in their possession. They entered the competition stage and took their sides. They had the soul tools that they had crafted earlier on them. Hu Yuhao placed his shield flat down on his legs and gently caressed its surface. The unsettled expression on his face gradually disappeared, and he finally displayed a self-confident smile. He was absolutely certain that this shield was one of the most successful soul tools that he had crafted over his entire life, and had named it the Adjudication Shield. Are you guys ready? The judges inquired from their elevated seats. I'm ready. Both Hu Yuhao and 98 responded at the same time. All right. Bring up the protective barriers. The pale yellow protective barriers rose up and formed a hemisphere that encompassed the entire competition stage. The barriers were there to prevent the soul tools unleashed from damaging the Golden Hall. Hu Yuhao raised the shield in his hands. 98 seemed as casual as ever on the other side, and he raised a strange-looking soul cannon with his right hand. Begin. The round of 6 final match began with the judge's announcement. Hu Yuhao raised his shield in front of him. However, not a single soul ring could be seen on his body. On the other side, whistling sounds could be heard beneath 98's feet as 2 yellow, 2 purple, and 2 black soul rings rose up, one after another. Dense soul power undulations immediately rippled from his body. He wasn't at all hasty to attack. Instead, he took a few steps forward as he placed his soul cannon on his shoulder. Of the other 6 soul tools that he had created, other than his invincible barrier, he took the longest to craft this one. This soul cannon looked like it was embedded into his shoulder, and it gave the audience the feeling that it was part of his body. This was a quality that an outstanding soul engineer had to possess, and every soul tool he created had to have chemistry with the soul engineer's body. This soul cannon was silver-white in color, and faintly radiated green light. The cannon's mouth was flat and rectangular, and the entire cannon seemed a little peculiar. The black, flat opening began to flicker with light. 98 channeled his soul power, and a soul tool on his waist behind his back erupted with light. He also had an energy-gathering soul tool, but his energy-gathering soul tool was a little gentler than the one that belonged to 85. At least, the soul power undulations didn't seem as strong. However, once this soul tool was activated, the soul cannon on his shoulder erupted with green light. There appeared to be black streaks of air circulating around the cannon's mouth. Huo Yuhao hid his body completely behind his shield. Blue light sparkled on his shield, and a faint wheel of light could be seen that increased the shield's defensive area of effect. The hemispherical protrusion in the shield's center didn't change much, while the silver-white regions at the shield's center and on its edges shone with relatively more intense white light. The shield had quite an impressive outward appearance to the naked eye. However, the gamblers who had placed their bets on Huo Yuhao felt their hopes dwindling to nothing. Could he really grind down his opponent's soul power with this shield? They witnessed Huo Yuhao's soul rings at this moment. He had 2 yellow, 2 purple, and 1 black soul ring. This was the optimal soul ring combination, but he only had 5. He was a soul king, so how he could win a war of attrition against a soul emperor? A soul emperor's soul power was at least 2 or 3 times more plentiful than a soul king's. Huo Yuhao rarely revealed his soul ring's true colors to outsiders so that he could hide his identity. He was using imitation to mask their actual colors. 98's soul cannon fired, and a dark red beam stretched through the air, sweeping towards Huo Yuhao. Inside the central guest lounge, the third elder muttered under his breath, "I want to see how this fellow is going to defend himself against Moku's corrosive decomposition cannon." With the Darkness Green Dragon's amplifications, this corrosive decomposition cannon would be considered very powerful even among Class 6 soul tools. It's very explosive, but its continuous destructiveness is its strongest attribute. No matter what deflective and absorptive effects that shield possesses, it can only take effect on material entities. How is he going to defend himself? Huo Yuhao proved how he could defend himself on the competition stage. He placed his shield in front of him, and began to chant something under his breath. The shield blocked everyone's vision, and his eyes suddenly turned grey. The audience watched as the corrosive decomposition beam was about to reach his shield. A grey streak suddenly burst from Huo Yuhao's body and condensed into a sphere of smoky fog that blocked the beam's forward movement, just like that. A series of crackling sounds could be heard as steam rose up from the competition stage. Huo Yuhao didn't move at all, but a black skeleton suddenly appeared before him. This skeleton seemed to have been called from nowhere, and the grey fog blocked the light beam for one moment before this black skeleton forcefully intervened. The skeleton quickly turned dark green. Right after that, it emitted an aching, clattering sound that made it seem as if it could collapse at any time. As Huo Yuhao continued chanting, streams of grey air continued to surge from his body, flowing into the black skeleton in front of him. Upon absorbing these streams of air, the skeleton began to totter about. However, it only continued to totter, and not collapse. Everyone couldn't help but feel astonished upon witnessing this scene. Was 66 not planning on using his soul tool to take 98's attack? Wasn't he clearly using the power of his martial soul? Was his martial soul a skeleton? Furthermore, was he summoning a skeleton outside his body? However, why did none of his soul rings light up upon strengthening that skeleton's defenses? While everyone else was dumbstruck, Huo Yuhao himself was somewhat astonished. As he used the necromantic arts his teacher had imparted to him, he felt that it was somewhat incompatible with his spirit eyes. His spiritual power was relatively strong right now. The moment he felt something was off, he immediately withdrew his spirit eyes along with its soul rings. Moreover, he suddenly felt as if something in his mind had shattered. Right after that, he felt a trace of enlightenment, along with a large amount of information that filled his spiritual sea. The sudden appearance of so many astonishing things in one's mind would definitely have struck any other person dumb. However, Huo Yuhao was a person who had cultivated his spiritual power to the concrete immaterial realm. After a brief moment of astonishment, he immediately used his spiritual power to temporarily seal these pieces of memory-like information in his spiritual sea. At the same time, he continued chanting his spell. A strange scene stunned the entire audience. Under the eyes of everyone present, a grey soul ring quietly rose from Hua Yuhao's feet. Right, a grey soul ring that was filled with a deathly stillness. The instant it appeared, it seemed as if all of the light within the golden hall had vanished. A tall, faint figure appeared behind Hua Yuhao's back. Although it was only a silhouette, and its facial features couldn't be clearly seen, the boundless aura coming from it stunned the entire field. Practically everyone seated in the center of the VIP lounge got to their feet at the same time, their expressions that of bewilderment. Even the female vice-founder wasn't an exception to this. All of them quickly moved to the window, staring at Hua Yuhao. Hua Yuhao felt his senses immediately change the instant the grey soul ring appeared. The various spells of the divine law of necromancy that Calamity Necromancer Electrolux had imparted to him in the past began to appear clearly in his mind. Every single spell appeared like a construct or model, and the originally superfluous spells seemed to shorten. Now, he would be able to cast any of his spells as long as he followed the models within his mind. Hua Yuhao raised the shield with his right hand. Due to the brief pause he had, the black skeleton in front of him had already exploded with a bang and turned into small fragments because of the corrosive decomposition cannon. The cannon charge then landed on his adjudication shield at practically the same instant. Unexpectedly, Hua Yuhao put his shield away and placed it on his legs. At this moment, 98 finally saw the deathly grey in his eyes. As the person who was on the stage, 98 was the person who could sense the change in Hua Yuhao's aura the most clearly. This was a choking feeling that made it seem as though his throat was being crushed, and the enormous pressure and deathly stillness made him suffocate somewhat. He could only increase the amount of soul power in his corrosive decomposition cannon and hope that it could take Hua Yuhao out. After putting his shield down, Hua Yuhao raised his right hand. Gently tapping the air, he began to chant once again. He felt the soul power in his body roil about quickly, and the spiritual power in his mind surged forth in torrents. It felt as though something was simultaneously drawing out the spiritual and soul power in his body. A large, pitch-black door appeared in front of Hua Yuhao without any prior warning, and the discharge of the corrosive decomposition cannon inches away from him fell right into that door. That large door seemed as thin as a feather, but the corrosive decomposition stopped moving after falling into it, as though it had fallen in quicksand. Right after that, a mournful howl rang out from that door. With a wave of his hand, the door that had already fallen to the ground several meters away from him instantly stood upright. A grey figure pounced out from the door, charging straight towards 98. This was a metallic green humanoid with a pair of wings on its back. However, it didn't have a head. This sudden change of events left 98 greatly astonished, yet somewhat frenetic. He paused the firing of his corrosive decomposition cannon for a brief moment, then aimed it at that zombie. Shishi. An ear-piercing shriek mixed with the poison mist caused by the corrosion in the air rang out. However, the headless zombie only paused for a brief moment when facing 98's attack. Right after that, it charged forward, ignoring the destructive might of the corrosive decomposition cannon. His body was tougher than cast iron. This necromantic spell was called the Spectral Gate, and its activation would create a door linked to the netherworld, summoning a spectre that could aid one in combat. According to the memories that Electrolux had left him, the Spectral Gate could summon a spectre whose strength could range from a 3-ringed to a 6-ringed Orthodox Soulmaster from the Doluor continent. The specific spectre that would be summoned, on the other hand, would be dependent on one's luck. The fact that the headless iron zombie was able to directly take on a corrosive decomposition cannon truly astonished Hua Yuhao. However, he didn't dare to dally around. He quickly released another necromantic spell. A transparent grey whip appeared before Hua Yuhao. With a wave, it struck the headless iron zombie. Immediately, the headless zombie let out a mournful shriek. A ray of light that was identical to it in texture was drawn out from its body, before merging back into it. This was the Death Whip, a weapon which could directly attack an opponent's soul. If it was used on one's own summoned spectres, it would raise its combat strength for a brief period of time. After being struck by the Death Whip, a bronze tint appeared on the headless zombie's skin. It forcefully took another cannon shot, getting within 5 meters of 98. Currently, 98 was truly feeling somewhat panicked. Smacking his chest with his right hand, he instantly released a white soul ring that tossed the rushing headless zombie away. Nobody would have thought that the Elite Soul Engineering Tournament would end up like this, but nobody could say that Hua Yuhao was breaking the rules, either. After all, the round of 6 permitted the use of Soul Master abilities. Only, Hua Yuhao's abilities were overly strange. These were clearly the skills of an evil Soul Master. If this wasn't an underground tournament, some of the Orthodox Soul Engineers there would have called him into question. However, this was the Duskwater Alliance, and nothing could stop the betting from continuing. Hua Yuhao seldom used necromantic magic, but it helped conceal his identity within the Golden Hall. At this moment, the skill with which he used these magics began to improve. The headless zombie immediately charged forward again after being pushed back. While it took care of 98, Hua Yuhao began to chant another spell. A red ring of light quietly appeared beneath 98, rising into the air. Right after that, a dark red skull appeared above him, and his movements seemed to slow somewhat. This was the Curse of Blood, a necromantic spell that could slow a person down. This spell had another terrifying bit to it. Once its target was attacked, the effect of the curse would flare up, injuring him even more. After casting this spell, Hua Yuhao's chanting became even more resounding. As his strange chants continued to ring out, the illusory figure of light behind him became even clearer. One could faintly see that this figure was precisely the divine law of necromancy, Calamity Necromancer Electroluck. Naturally, only Hua Yuhao was able to identify him. Everyone else could only see the blurry image of an old man. The strength of a necromantic spell was normally proportional to the length of its chant. The longer the chant, the stronger the spell would be. An intense sense of crisis enveloped 98. However, he currently had no way of taking Hua Yuhao out. That headless zombie was simply too quick, and not only did it not fear death, it was even as tough as steel. The most he could do with the soul tools he'd crafted during this tournament was push it back, or even injure it somewhat. However, he wouldn't be able to take it out. 98 also understood that he needed to use a few abilities which were specifically strong against the zombie to take it out. However, how was he to find a soul tool that was specifically strong against it right now? Hua Yuhao's strange chanting was like a voodoo curse to him. As his expression kept changing, 98 suddenly rolled on the ground, dodging the headless zombie's charge. Right after that, a ray of light erupted behind his back. The powerful momentum created by the soul thrusters on his back sent him flying straight towards Hua Yuhao. At the same time, he activated a golden invincible barrier, and a pitch-black dagger appeared in his hand. This dagger was a corrosive decomposition dagger, a close combat class 4 soul tool. Upon striking one's target, this dagger would quickly corrode and decompose an opponent's body and outer defenses, all the way until it pierced its target. 98 wasn't just a soul engineer who specialized in long-range attacks, he was somewhat capable in the field of close combat as well. Faced with the headless zombie's incessant interruptions, he realized that if this continued, he'd be finished if Hua Yuhao used even a single soul skill. As such, he was forced to take a risk out of desperation. Glancing at Hua Yuhao's wheelchair-bound self, he knew that as long as he could get close to the latter and interrupt his mysterious chanting, he'd be able to end the fight. As long as his invincible barrier was around, the headless zombie wouldn't be able to injure him either. The headless zombie was exceptionally strong and tough, but it didn't have any abilities beyond these two physical traits. Even though it was chasing 98 from behind with all its might, it wasn't capable of stopping someone who was traveling at full speed using soul thrusters. How large could the tournament stage be? Almost immediately after using his soul thruster, 98 reached Hua Yuhao. He swung his sword chi-filled blade downwards, straight at Hua Yuhao's head. When he did so, he saw a trace of regret flit through Hua Yuhao's eyes, before an enormous shield suddenly appeared and blocked his entire line of sight. A dark green layer of light instantly rose from the shield's surface. 98 gazed at it expectantly, ready for his corrosive decomposing dagger to pierce straight through the shield. To his astonishment, however, his dagger was the one that seemed to corrode when it came in contact with the shield. It was as if the tip of his knife had been dulled. Immediately afterwards, a ring of light lit up on the shield's surface and sent 98's body flying like a cannon shell. This was a Class 7 soul tool known as the Adjudication Shield. Hua Yuhao had finally finished it after 10 hours of hard work and the use of his Life Guardian blade. Of the 3 abilities it had, 2, Reflection and Absorption, could only be used on material objects. They were useless against anything energy-based. Its last ability, on the other hand, was called Adjudication. Just like its other 2 abilities, it could only be used on objects. However, Adjudication was an ability that had been passed on by the Life Guardian blade. If used, it would instantly absorb the life force of any substance it was currently in contact with and destroy it. This ability was capable of affecting any and all soul tools Class 7 and below, and was still somewhat useful against soul tools above Class 7, albeit with reduced effectiveness. This could be considered a godlike ability for soul engineers who specialized in close combat. With this shield in hand, why would Hua Yuhao be afraid of any opponents getting close to him? He hadn't stopped chanting since the start of the battle. Following this brief interlude, Hua Yuhao's chanting had already lasted for over 10 seconds. Finally, his chanting came to an end. When he did, his eyes had been tinted dark purple, and the enormous figure behind him froze momentarily. Immediately afterwards, Hua Yuhao raised his right hand and pointed at 98. The moment he did so, a dark purple light covered 98's skin. Surprisingly, even his invincible barrier hadn't been able to block Hua Yuhao's necromantic magic. As soon as the dark purple light covered his body, 98 let out a miserable howl. Despite being inside of his golden invincible barrier, he felt as if every inch of his body was melting. By channeling all of the soul power in his body, he found that the most he could do was slow the melting. Once he'd finished casting this spell, Hua Yuhao's face turned somewhat pale. With the experience he'd gained from casting a few spells, he discovered that necromantic spells mainly relied on his spiritual power, they didn't drain much of his soul power. However, his specialty was precisely his spiritual power. His current spiritual power was comparable in prowess to that of a soul doluor. And yet, even with this level of spiritual power, casting that necromantic spell had instantly cost him nearly a third of his total spiritual power. The strength of his necromantic magic could be seen from this. This was withering, an extremely powerful single-target magic. It directly struck the target's spiritual plane, in turn igniting the target's life force. This would create a mysterious elemental transformation that lead to the target melting from within. Regardless of how much strength one possessed, one could only use the energy within their body to resist Huoyuhao's withering. If they were incapable of doing so, they'd wither away and die. Moreover, withering lasted for a full minute. Seeing that the situation wasn't going too well, the third elder, who was seated in the middle of the VIP lounge, couldn't wait any longer. He stood up and shouted, 98 admits defeat. Quickly end your skill. With a flash of light, the third elder then appeared above the stage and floated there. Huoyuhao shivered inwardly. He truly had gone somewhat overboard with his performance today. Fortunately, he'd only used his necromantic abilities. Who are you? What gives you the right to make a decision for him? Huoyuhao asked indifferently. If the third elder didn't care about the Duskwater Alliance's reputation, he would have charged straight towards the soul barrier. Instead, he shouted, I'm his teacher. I mean what I say. You'd better end your attack right now. Sure. Huoyuhao didn't insist on continuing. The elder standing in midair had to be at least a soul doluor. He was an existence that he couldn't handle yet. He pointed his finger at 98 and ended his withering. Feeling as if his skin had suddenly turned to mud, the latter immediately crumpled. The omnipresent feeling that his skin was melting had filled 98's heart with fear. In reality, the pain he'd felt had just been a false sensation. So long as his soul power didn't run out, withering wouldn't turn him into a withered corpse. That terrifying feeling he'd had was simply one of withering's effects. After all, it was mainly an attack directed at his soul. Following the death of Electrolux, Huoyuhao was the only person in the world capable of using necromantic spells. Who in the world could have experience against these sorts of attacks? Huoyuhao looked towards the three stunned referees and proudly stated, I've won. Bring my rewards to me. As soon as the defensive barrier had been lowered, the third elder quickly walked over to 98 and helped him up. After checking his body over and ensuring that he was unharmed, he let out a sigh of relief. When he turned back to Huoyuhao, his gaze was somewhat astonished. The three referees had already stepped onto the stage. However, they didn't walk towards Huoyuhao. Instead, they hesitantly looked towards the third elder. At that moment, another elder stepped onto the stage. This was the person who'd previously been called second elder in the VIP lounge. Your subordinates greet the Alliance Master. The referees all simultaneously bowed towards the second elder. Get up. Why haven't you given our little friend his rewards? Our Duskwater Alliance has always prided itself on its honesty, and would never go back on its word. The second elder, who was also the Duskwater Alliance Master, had a stately appearance. After combing his white hair behind his head, he put an amiable smile on his face. This, combined with his fluttering white beard, made it so that he gave off a good impression to anyone meeting him for the first time. The moment he spoke, the three referees didn't dare to dally any longer. They quickly walked over to Huoyuhao and handed over both the Hunction's Blessing and the Darkness Green Dragon. No, you can't give it to him. That's my Darkness Green Dragon. 98 had finally woken up at this point. When he saw what was happening, he immediately got to his feet and charged over. Huoyuhao raised his right hand and pointed it at 98. The latter's face immediately became pale, and he ducked to the side. Huoyuhao smirked. Not anymore. If you're willing to bet, you also have to be willing to admit defeat. Are you trying to renege on your bet in front of so many people? The third elder's face immediately turned somewhat ugly. He grabbed 98, who was still trying to charge over, and slapped him. Was losing face in front of everyone here not enough? Follow me back. With that, he dragged 98 offstage and vanished without a trace. The master of the Duskwater Alliance smiled as he stood on the stage. Hello, young friend. I'm the owner of the Duskwater Alliance. You can call me Nangong Wan. Nangong Wan? Huoyuhao was somewhat astonished when he heard his name. He'd thought that Nangong Wan was a girl's name. Greetings, Alliance Master Nangong. I'm delighted to meet you. He'd finally attracted the upper echelon of the Duskwater Alliance's attention. Although he couldn't see anything from the surface, the fact that he was speaking so amiably to him after seeing his necromantic magic said a lot about him. Nangong Wan didn't say much more. He turned towards the three referees. All right, go ahead and announce the end of the tournament. Yes. The referee loudly announced, after a heated contest, the Duskwater Alliance's top three in this year's Radiant City Elite Soul Engineering Tournament have been decided. These three are 66, 88, and 96. Besides the prizes they'll be receiving today, they'll also receive the opportunity to represent our Duskwater Alliance in the final tournament against the other two alliances. With this, the tournament had finally ended. There were both happy and disappointed people. Some of the gamblers who'd been daring enough to place bets on Hua Yuhao began to cheer loudly. Others, who'd bet on the wrong person, could only hang their heads dejectedly. Nangong Wn walked over to Hua Yuhao and smiled. "Young friend, could we have a little chat?" Hua Yuhao's expression became vigilant and he said, "There's nothing we have to discuss. I've only come here to win the prize. If you want to have a chat with me, come and so when I'm the overall champion. Now then, according to the rules of the tournament, I'll be taking away this shield I've made." Even as he spoke, he was already looking towards the prize below the stage with a greedy glint in his eyes. Nangong Wan smiled slightly. "Naturally, that's fine. Since younger brother isn't willing to talk right now, we'll have a nice chat after you win the overall tournament representing our Duskwater Alliance. There's something that I'd like to tell you in advance, though. If you win this honor for our Duskwater Alliance, we'll give you an additional reward on top of the reward from the overall tournament." "That's better," Hua Yuhao answered. At this point, Hikaitu had already stepped onto the stage and started pushing his wheelchair forwards so that he could claim his prize. Nangong Wn squinted as he looked at Hua Yuhao, revealing a somewhat thoughtful expression. All of the doors in the Golden Hall were now wide open, allowing the various gamblers to walk out. After watching the tournament for an entire night, everybody felt lethargic. Once they'd retrieved their prizes, Hua Yuhao, Hikaitu, Wang Donga, and Nana all walked back to the Qingse Hotel. Hua Yuhao suddenly squinted and said, "Little Dong, take me back towards that pub we went to last time. After taking 256 steps, take a left into the alleyway. Quick. This video will end here.